There has been a confrontation between the Irish native people and the police forces in Ireland that has started to escalate. Videos are coming out of police organising in battle lines and pepper spraying the locals. Now this is taking place in a rural town in Wicklow called Newtown Mount Kennedy, near the famous monastery of Glendalough. Now what is driving all this tension that is leading to the police cracking down on their own citizens? You see, a property in this small town has been designated as a new asylum centre, where a considerably large amount of migrants will be moved in buses and installed in the community. Now you might say to yourself, why would people protest such a thing? That's very horrible, very backwards. Well, this is because these types of projects do not have a good reputation. I had a cousin who went to America and was surprised to see miles of homeless people leading into California, which he assumed was going to be this sort of heaven on earth. And this seemed very strange and foreign to me until recently you go up to Dublin and you'll see the same thing. Tents all over the inner city streets. And of course, if you question this, you get gaslit. You get told that these poor people are escaping war. But there's a problem with this, because you almost never see young women and families. It's all men that are my age, my height, my size. And so, of course, I understand the people of Wicklow. Why would you want more of me around? I'm a big dork. Imagine 150, 200 of me loitering around your town. I don't think that'd be very nice, would it? And almost the entirety of Ireland has made the decision that they don't want this to happen to their small towns. They don't want busloads of men coming in and getting installed into their communities. It's just not something that they're interested in. Consistently, about 80% of the population have said in polls and votes and surveys that they do not want this to happen. This is not something they think is a priority. You see, the Irish are worried about the housing crisis, the fact that houses are so expensive. They're worried about the rising cost of living. They're worried about the fact that they know people who are Irish, who are from this nation, that are homeless, that don't have houses. And they see it as a misplacement of resources and priorities, where we take all this money and we dedicate it towards these strange importation projects. Now, interestingly, the regime never asked the people if they're down with these projects. Instead, it's just assumed that they've been given power, that they're going to move forward with these types of projects. They cast off a load of political jargon about, the responsibilities towards certain moral principles or something like this, that this stuff must be done. And it's not really a question of consent. Instead, it's going to happen whether you like it or not. And we will bring out riot police if you disagree. And we wouldn't get your hopes up that the government's going to, throw a referendum and ask the people what they would like, because the last time they did that, they kind of got obliterated. They got humiliated, and it was revealed that they didn't have a clue what the people wanted at all. So unfortunately for the Irish people, their only real option to get their voice heard is to show up to these planned projects and demand that they don't go through, and protest and stand there and wave flags and wave banners and say, we really don't want this to happen. Now, of course, you may imagine that the type of people who would show up to such a protest would only ever be far-right lunatics. It couldn't be anything else, could it? But that's not true either. Certainly you get a couple of young fellas, but you see mixed among them a large amount of very concerned young mammies. And so it's this coalition of young fellas, mammies and locals from the town that form this axis of evil that for some reason want to protest these grand projects. But the Irish state has made it clear that they're not going to listen to this type of coalition. They are not going to listen to protest. They're not going to listen to the voice of the unheard, like we did when BLM showed up, when those Americans went crazy and started to burn their cities down. We all in Ireland stood up and we said, oh, it's so awful what's happening with these poor BLM people who experience systemic racism, who are kicked down and ignored and not listened to by that awful American state. Finally, they've stood up and they've used the voice of protest. Sure, their protests are fiery. Sure, there's rocks getting thrown, windows getting broken. Sure, there's buildings burning down. But they're mostly peaceful protests. And they're the only way that these people can get their voice out there into the world. And that is fantastic. We love it when our African American friends do it. But when the native Irish feel the same, when the native Irish feel like their voice is unheard, when they have to resort to the language of the unheard, protests, all of a sudden, police crackdowns, riot gear, all these things are good. All these things are essential. All these people protesting are maniacs, are evil, are twisted, or they're racist. Of course, that's what it is. They're part of systemic racism, which is why the police must come in and crush them. In this case, the system and the police forces turn out to be correct in oppressing the will of the Irish people. and imposing its will upon them. But of course, these contradictions that I point out, it's clearly an instance where I just don't understand what's going on. The sophisticated people, they have their finger on the pulse. They really know how things are working. Because, it doesn't make sense to me why they were all cheering on Hamas there a while ago. Oh yes, these violent rebels resisting an oppressive colonizing force. How noble, how profound, how much we support them. Hands up for the rebels. But not when this happens at home. The Irish people are not good enough for us. We're intelligent, we're intellectual, we're well read. And these country bumpkins, they're stupid. They drive their tractors, they're uneducated, they don't know about things. They're truck drivers and farmers, carpenters, probably police officers, but they're bumpkins, they're dummies, they're rednecks probably. And they should learn to shut up and do what we tell them. And so because of this conflict, because of this apparent misunderstanding between the state and its people, Ireland has come to blows. Ireland is now fighting against its own regime. Once again, Ireland is experiencing a militarized police force walking on their streets, imposing their will upon the people. This is something that we fought to overcome for over a century. Yet, because we've got complacent, it now has returned. So Ireland looks like it's on the precipice of a chaotic time. I think it would be prudent for our leaders to consider what it means that we live in a democratic republic and the authority that the people's voice is supposed to have. If they wish to go against this, I think it'd be important for them to be transparent and articulate what their actual will is and what they are really doing in this country at all. And for any of you out there who feel a bit dejected, who feel that your will is being taken from you, that people are not listening to your voice, keep in mind that only a couple of weeks ago, that referendum did not go very well for the regime. They were obviously arrogant coming into it, and they got exposed, which shows a good thing, that our votes do still count, that getting politically involved and voting for what you would like to see happen definitely counts at this point. So I would encourage you to get active, get educated, and prepare yourself a tense but critical couple of years. This, my friends, was a video on the crazy situation in Ireland over the last week. Now, what I'd like to do is present you a bit of a higher overview about the situation in Ireland, the history in Ireland, and how it has led us up to this moment where it feels like Ireland's getting a little bit tense, to the point now where we might see a transformation in consciousness take place that might turn into some political realities changing. Who knows? I think this is very interesting to look from a psychological perspective, because you're watching the collective unconscious of Ireland shift into different value systems as we've gone through history. So I'd say you would enjoy it for that high level view as well. And it will also inform you about the context for what's going on with current events. So I will dive in now and explain to you what's happening, and I hope you enjoy. Ireland has gone through quite the revolution in the last year. We seem like we have developed an affinity for burning things down. Now, the revolution is not the fact that people are starting to torch things, but more to do with the change in people's mindsets. You see, the last century for the Irish has seen many profound revolutions. First of all, our historical one where we won our freedom from the British, which was pretty much 100 years ago to the day. And that was predicated upon a rise in national consciousness. You see, it's well known in 1914 that we reached a pivot point in European history. Europe was in this position where it was master of the entire earth. It had colonial powers all across the world. The British Empire stood as the most enormous empire in all of world history. We had risen up through the Industrial Revolution for about 100 years and achieved the first stretch of civilization that went beyond Rome in progress. Now, that was a big first that people don't quite understand anymore. And sitting at the head of all this was the European royal order, the kings of Europe. They were still pretty strong. You might have had France, which had had its revolution for about 100 years, but you still had the German king, you still had the Russian Tsar, you still had the Queen and King in England. You still had these institutions that represented the authority of the royalty. And Europe was understood as Christian Europe under the sovereignty of the Germanic kings. But in 1914, in 1917, in 1918, in 1921, we see events all across Europe that tear this apart at the seams. We see the fall of the German kings. We see the fall of the Russian king, and the Tsar ends up getting shot. We see the British Empire shear apart at the seams and lose everything. And in its place, we see the arrival of democratic nationalism. Europe from this point forward becomes a democracy, a federation of democracies. And of course, I'm telling you all this because it's during this crucial pivot point that we see the arrival of the Irish nation. And so from this revolution and point forward, Ireland is a new republic that introduces itself to the broader collection of European republics that are now going to be a part of the new way the world works. And we continue to live like this all throughout the 20th century. Now, what happens across the West, starting in America mainly, but also in Europe as well, is the rising of a new form of consciousness, a new way of thinking about reality and the world. There's many ways that you can skin this cat, but it is interesting to notice that a predicate was set up, an axiom, a presupposition was set up during this period of revolutions in 1914, 1917, 1920s, where we assumed that the old order of the kings, the royalty, the hierarchy, the church, Catholicism, the royal systems, the religious systems, that culture was representative of something bad that we all wanted to rebel from and escape from. That type of hierarchy was this monstrous entity that took from us our freedom. And this predicate ran through into the 20th century and built up steam as it went forward. And so by the end of the 20th century, we have a psychology that completely pathologizes anything associated with what was dominant during this period. So that would include being a male, being a patriarch, being European, being Christian, being for hierarchy, and essentially not having a disadvantage to your life of some sort. This is famously the woke movement. And what formed in the woke movement was a coalition against that identity. And this is what some people call identity politics. And this coalition meant that if you were in any way different to this central archetype, you had some type of right to complain. You had a reason to be resentful, and therefore you had a moral obligation to take political power. So if you were homosexual, if you were female, if you were foreign, if you were ancestrally a slave, something like this coalition would accept you within it. Now, this type of thinking became superordinate in the West from the 1990s until around about now, and you saw another revolution take place. A revolution in political structures, a revolution in university structure. And this got to the point where you're seeing what people call reverse racism taking place in universities in America, where if you're European, you basically get voted out of being in the university. If you're a white man, you can say good luck to be getting an education in one of the high-level Ivy League schools because of all these quotas and things like this. And so, after about 30 years of this really kicking into gear, we see this incredible transformation in all these countries across the West that has left many people flailing and panicking. You see people like Elon Musk come out and give out stink about it, Jordan Peterson, all these characters. And of course, Ireland goes along with this as well. Ireland is a part of this united, shared Western consciousness, the collective unconscious that mimetically spits ideas into all of our minds. And so the Irish have their own version of this transformation. Now, of course, the Irish frame this within the context of our own history. We will say that we had Catholicism, which hugely oppressed us in the past, was a horrible thing. And it did all these terrible things to us because Catholicism was extremely present in Irish life. And so for this reason, we want to rebel against Catholicism and, very interestingly, adopt all of these broad cultural ideas that are getting spread out of the general European malaise. Now, I really like this way of thinking because you get an awful lot of people who are very uppity and they think that they're deciding, to go along with these ideas because of critical thinking or rationality or something like that. And of course, that's not true at all. It is just them literally following trends when you actually understand it and understanding the enormity of the trends and how above their heads most of this stuff are. And in fact, they are essentially the opposite of a critical thinker, but somebody who is caught up among the wave. And of course, we're not separate to this. Many of the more reactionary stuff I will discuss, I am sure I'm caught up in waves as well, and we must always be a little bit on guard for that. But nevertheless, this coalition of the minorities, this woke movement, gained an enormous amount of momentum and force and began to form its revolution in Irish culture. And this revolution only achieved its state of blossoming about 5 to 10 years ago, when we saw the arrival of pro-abortion laws, the arrival of gay marriage laws, the arrival of this general acceptance of these things that would be considered heretical in Catholicism. And of course, the way the Irish people sold this to themselves is through the language of progress. This is Ireland finally shearing off those final residues of the past, this Catholic programming that we have, and entering into the new world. The new world that conveniently all the rest of the West is a part of, because it's the educated way to do things. Unfortunately for the Irish, many things snuck in alongside of this woke consciousness that have much more animosity for the Irish people in a direct sense. You see, a big part of this coalition of the minorities is that they need to find grievances within people who feel like they've been slighted by European culture. So, Black Lives Matter is a perfect example of this. It's one of the predicates, one of the foundational movements of this coalition of the minorities. And the whole concept there is that there's horrible, racist, white supremacist systems in place in the world that are designed to punish black people and keep them down. And these things have been in place since the days of colonialism. And the entire world was built by the colonizers of the European continent. And they have essentially created these systems through capitalism, this giant, all these tentacles spreading out from England and Europe and America that are all designed to extract resources and exploit things out of the brown people and put them down. Now, this is where you start to get some fascinating tension points and ironies in Ireland, because Ireland is quite unique among the European nations as being a colony, being one of the slave states, if you so will. The British colonized Ireland and constructed one of these colonial infrastructures in order to exploit the Irish. The Irish experienced penal laws which banned them from owning property. Of all the people in the world that would understand what it means to be oppressed by a colonizing force and have a systemic infrastructure put on top of them to keep them down, it would be the Irish. And they have probably experienced it longer than almost any person nowadays, brown or black, complaining about colonialism, because we've been under this system for about 800 years. Now, this has been quite annoying for us Irish, because we'd love to be able to cash in on this in the oppression Olympics. We'd like to, form up with the minorities and say, well, we got a bum deal as well, so let's see a little bit of reparations come Ireland's way. We'd like some of this, minority privilege, because we've been through it. We may as well cash in. And we would always notice that we're never allowed to be a part of it. And we would always be addressed and treated like how we look, not what our history means. People would come to Ireland, often from countries where they're full of black people, full of brown people, and they would say to us that you're a colonizer. And I've had this experience many times myself, and I've would have friends and stuff that maybe from Venezuela or something like this. And they'd categorize me as a white man, a colonizer, as part of that European project. I don't get exceptional status, it seems. And this has caused quite a big issue in Irish consciousness. And I've noticed this speaking to a lot of people, that there's people coming into our country that we invite in with a lot of goodwill. And they don't take the time to learn our culture and understand our history and our struggle and our past. They kind of brush over all that stuff. Now, I'm no fan of school myself. I fell asleep in plenty of classes. But you'd kind of think that this one they'd want to get right, just so they don't get anybody a little bit, cheesed off. But instead they don't. And instead they come in with a preloaded set of concepts that come from America, with systemic racism plugged in, with these concepts of colonizer and oppression and these types of issues. And so you'll have people in Ireland talking about Black Lives Matter, trying to suggest that the Irish state is a racist state, that is a system of oppression upon black people in Ireland. And I would always sit down these people who were saying this to me, and I'd try to explain it to them. It's like, this is really going to irk Irish people if you poke this in them, because our entire structure and system was about us breaking free from a systemically racist project of the Anglos over the Celts, and we broke that and we created a system for ourselves. That was the point of this country. The entire point of the Republic is that we're not going to have some type of structure imposing us that screws us over. Now, you coming over here and accusing us of this, it just doesn't sit well. We've been particularly tentative, been particularly meticulous to make sure that we construct something that's not going to lead us to getting screwed over for another 800 years. And you're coming in and you're telling us that we're doing something wrong, that we need to change things, that we're oppressing you, that we're white Anglos, that we're like all those other colonizers. Now, I'm saying all this because I've noticed this tension point has extrapolated into a revolution of consciousness and basically taken down the woke project in Ireland in an absolute sense. And it's only really happened in the last 6 months or so that really has just all fallen apart. Because about 10 years ago, there were some people who were thinking this stuff, but generally speaking, most people were just completely on board with the way the culture was going. They had been conditioned over how culture was working in Europe and America to look at, for example, their gay prime minister, Leo Varadkar, as like a fantastic thing. And Leo presents himself very well. He speaks very well. He's very controlled, very, very calm, very graceful. He's a very intelligent, well-educated man, like a medical doctor. So like, it's very hard to hate the guy, you know? So most people were like, look, Leo's great. You know, we love Leo. He's fantastic. And on top of this as well, we had all these things about abortion and stuff like this. And everybody in Ireland hates the Catholic Church. Well, all right, everybody's a lot, but it's not very popular anymore because there's been lots of TV shows about them killing children and stuff, and the Magdalene sisters where they'd like hurt the women and stuff. So the culture was in a place where people despised the Catholic Church, hated everything associated with this, hated the constrictions of, you know, against homosexuality that came from this stuff. And we were truly an enormously liberal place. We were becoming much, much more atheist, much, much more liberal, way more open. And this was seen as just unanimously good. And one thing that Ireland might have that is a good thing and a bad thing is that we are very herd consciousness, you know. We operate as a crew because we've had to defend ourselves as a crew, as a unit, as a mob before. So we've kind of got that inside of us. And so when we all believe one thing, we believe one thing, and it's very rare that you'll get some individuals around the edges. But this form of mob consciousness that was the liberal mob, you know, this was very powerful, very superordinate. It knew what reality was, and it saw it as good, and anything outside of this was just ridiculous. And I'd have friends and family and everybody was just like, if you brought up anything even remotely heretical, they'd be like, what are you talking about, you idiot, you stupid bum, you doofus. Close your mouth. Stop with this nonsense. They would not entertain this at all. And for that reason, I didn't really think Ireland was, you know, I thought Ireland was just going to go along with this project and see it through to the very end, whatever that might be, for good or bad. Maybe that would mean the destruction of the country, maybe put the country in an existential position. We don't know. So I was just sort of like, you know, this is Irish culture now, I guess. Better make the most of it. Better just be like, yep, well, I guess this is how we're doing things around here, gents. But as I said, that previous tension I started to notice, specifically around people coming into the country, foreigners, immigrants, whatever you want to call them, that started to really grow and really build, and people started to get like tilted because of it. And it's fascinating to see this because there was never much of a culture war like you saw in America, where you like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro are arguing over and back about what woke meant. Instead, what happened is there was this slow boil where people were talking about this in private and it was kind of fringe. And then everybody was talking about it after a while, but like everybody was sort of like, I don't know, whatever, this type of thing. And then around about last year, it just pivoted to the point where it was ubiquitous, to the point where, you know, everybody you knew that were previously 5 years ago talking about like completely liberal woke consciousness topics, everybody who was just like completely on board with the liberal project in every level, down to every value system, they had completely pivoted. It literally felt like overnight. They had completely transformed. And I mean, I knew an old guy I did jobs for, manual labor type of character, you know, and he's a smart man. But he, you know, prided himself in being very educated, and he's like loved Biden and loved Leo Varadkar and loved liberalism and loved all the woke stuff as well, and hated hearing people talk about immigrants. I saw that as just like backwards, stupid Irish potato chip head type crap. And he was somebody who read history and knew all about this stuff and was informed and proud of himself. And like, if I ever brought anything like that up, I would say like, maybe we should be asking questions about some of these things. He would just be like, just stupid. Just like, he just hated it. He was like, no, completely wrong, outside of all realms of possibility. And literally, I go and meet him then, like a year or so later. I haven't spoken to him in a while. And it's like, I'm kind of looking at it and I'm like, have you been on 4chan or something? It is like he had downloaded a software program. All of his opinions had completely pivoted to the opposite, and a revolution in consciousness had taken place. It was quite astounding to see. Now, it seems like it's the fruit, again, of this broader culture that's been going on, the anti-woke revolution, if you so will, that's been quite underground, and all the predicates of modern liberal culture is getting cut away and challenged and flipped on its head. And these guys are now the fruit of this, and it's essentially mainstream, where if you have a guy like this speaking about it, like, you know, this is a boomer who watches the TV and he's saying this stuff, you're like, all right, something has arrived here that's quite dramatic. Now, always when I talk to these guys and try to dig into their minds, why they're thinking this way all of a sudden, it would really come down to the feeling of being screwed. You see, this is a contractor, a manual labor, and he would do things like work on houses. And he would go around and he'd know a lot of different people. And he'd go up to Dublin and he'd work for someone and he'd make their kitchen or make their wardrobe or make their press or something like this, you know. And in this situation, he'd talk to the guy that he's making the press for, we'll say. And the guy in the press would talk about, you know, how some people moved in down the road and now things are dangerous, or something got stolen on him. Or there's a lot of violence in the street, or he saw somebody walking around with a machete. And he'd hear those stories. And then he'd go maybe get another job, and his job is to try and move in these like plywood bunk beds into this giant abandoned house because it's going to get turned into a migration center. And he'd see this. And he might go and he'd start asking people about this stuff. And then like word would get out about, you know, like, oh, all of these cost, every single one of those dudes going into that abandoned house, they cost $20,000 a year for each guy that goes in. That's coming out of your taxpayer money. And he'd be thinking to himself, well, why are we funding all these guys? And this is when this man would start to have incongruence, where his experienced reality was significantly different to what's getting pumped at him through things like the news, which is where he'd start to ask very difficult questions. He'd start to essentially say to himself, wait a second, there's problems here. Because he would hear that there's like a housing crisis and stuff like this. And there's a problem with capitalism and its exploitation of the Irish people by vulture funds and stuff. That's a big topic as well. But he doesn't have any direct experience with, you know, an abstract New York vulture fund. He doesn't have an experience of the lackeys in Dublin selling out the country this way. But he does have very tangible experiences of seeing these enormous projects getting put into place. And these people, he'd be going around to you know, do jobs, and there's all these people on welfare and stuff that are brought into the country and left on welfare, and it really start to irk him a lot. And so eventually there was this pivot point that happened where he began to distrust. He just started to say, I don't want what's happening to happen, and I don't like the way it feels like people are lying to me and screwing me over at the same time. Feels like they're taking my taxes off me. It feels like they're doing something to me, and then they're being weird behind the back, and I don't like that. And that feels snaky, and people have a good sense for when they're getting snaked. And this is a big problem because this is delegitimizing the current establishment, the current regime, and more specifically the general culture around this. And so what I noticed with this guy is that it was just a cascade where all of a sudden everything that he previously believed just fell apart because it almost like it all hinged on just one emotion, which was faith. Belief that the people in power were the educated, progressive people that were carrying us forward into a righteous future, and they were doing the best for Ireland and doing the best for the people. And all these liberal woke values were actually about helping people, about bringing us forward and releasing us from the restrictions of the past. That all was predicated on a feeling of trust, and that legitimized the established paradigm. And once that feeling's gone, once people start to really seriously feel like they're getting screwed, they're getting exploited, then once they start to distrust, once they start to get a sniff that there's something off, it all cascades, it all falls apart. Nietzsche spoke about Christianity actually like this quite interestingly, where he says that if the belief in God goes, the entire spiritual structure just implodes. It can't hold itself up. You can't have cultural Christianity. It's not possible. It needs to be total or it becomes nothing. And it's sort of like this, where this feeling of trust that this liberal project is taking us forward into a better future. The second that falls apart, a cascading event happens. And so this started to kick in the gear into an enormous amount of people around Ireland. And Irish people talk. Believe me, they talk to each other. So they would go and work this job or do this thing, and they come back and they talk to their buddies, and then they'd be out in the shop and they talk to their other buddy, and everybody would start to form this separate consensus to the established regime and what they are propagating via television. And the consensus underneath, like away from that, out in the countryside and stuff like this, and even in the cities, is now radically different. Now you have an extremely interesting problem because the regime is presenting a paradigm that has essentially been delegitimized by grassroots conversations by people on the floor. Now, in the last 3 or 4 years, this has actually started to get more extreme, the extent of the project to move people into Ireland. And again, Irish people talk, and Irish people are really well integrated and connected. So we would see WhatsApp groups where people would, take videos in the middle of the night of some old mammy walking out in her little estate in North Dublin or something like this, or somewhere else, somewhere further afoot perhaps. And there would be this line of police standing in the middle of the estate at night. None of the people in the estate had been told this is going to happen. And a bus would pull up and there's just this army of men would walk in. These asylum seekers, these migrant men. And then they would get up the next morning and all the kids would be going to school and there'd just be a load of dudes around. And they'd be looking at this and be like, what is happening? Like, why is this going on? And it started to get really extreme because, like mammies are... they're gonna wail and cry and scream, and so there'd be videos of them being like, oh my god, what are you doing? Why won't you stop? Like, what is happening here? What is going on? And this would really start to irk people. People like Conor McGregor would see this, for example. It would get passed around. Conor would see this, and someone like Conor McGregor is going to respond to that pretty intensely. And so this enormous collective anguish and will and angst and anger is building up. This frustration. It's like, why are all these projects happening? This obviously doesn't benefit us. We feel like we're getting screwed. People are very unhappy about this stuff. And it's building and building and building, but there's no real outlet for it until last winter there's a stabbing. A little girl during school gets knifed up by some crazy migrant who's been here since the early 2000s, like for nearly 15 years, maybe even 20 years at this point. And he's been on welfare essentially the whole time since then. And he goes and he attacks an Irish person, a little girl as well. And people freak. And all this energy, again, had been building up and it was at this like rattling tension point. And now there's an outlet for it. Now people are like, there's a problem. And so this event becomes a vessel at which all the frustration can be expressed and channeled into. And of course, this takes place in North Dublin, around about O'Connell Street, around about Talbot Street, which is, shall we say, a place that maybe 40 years ago would have had an awful lot of interest by the British for Republican activity going on. And this entire part of the city just goes crazy. And all the Irish around there just start to freak out. And all the young lads go nuts. And they start to burn stuff. They go absolutely wild and they find buses and stuff and they start to torch things. Now, of course, this is quite savage and barbaric. It's important to have a political will, a political project, a visionary plan to create an order and to create a future. That's the actual goal here. We don't want to just have meaningless sectarian violence. We've seen that in Ireland before and nobody liked that. But at the same time, there was quite a profound irony unveiled here because BLM, Black Lives Matter, this minority coalition in America that felt oppressed by the system, felt that the system was not representing them, needed to use the voice of the unheard, which is protesting. And they, of course, burned a couple of buildings down and they had a fiery but mostly peaceful protest, as they say. And they were given all passes and all forgiveness. And the Irish state as well was very, very nice to them. And, everybody put up their black squares on Instagram because that's what you did, because that's what, the culture is saying to do. That's what the collective consciousness says is moral and right. And we have something similar here where you have a young girl who's after basically an attempted murder. And, all these guys start freaking out. And again, barbaric, unproductive, but is their frustration illegitimate because it comes from white Irish people? Now, interestingly, the initial response to this was very stern, very severe. Immediate condemnation. Most people in culture would say this is a terrible thing. You had like Conor McGregor essentially disavowed it, although he was sort of like, oh, that's awful. That's awful. I hope you never do that again. And then his coach was very, very against this. John Kavanagh, which is a very like reasonable, down-to-earth guy, was like, this is crazy. No way. These guys are thugs. These guys are horrible. And kind of across the intellectual sphere and across, like, you know, the media and all this, they were saying, like, oh, these horrible thugs, these backwards thugs, far-right extremists and all this. And, you know, like, these dudes from North Dublin, you gotta love their fiery passions. They're fiery but mostly peaceful passions, but they've got a little bit of a hard edge. Like, let's call a spade here. They're certainly lads that would be ready to go in any situation. Let me put it this way. So the framing of this event is that it's crazy thugs doing crazy things, just burning down. They just decided to burn down Dublin randomly, you know. And it's like, well, I'm not sure if it was randomly. I think there's something to it, and I think they're voicing something much more than just the desire to burn down a bus. Let's put it this way. But the government pushed this through. They were like, this is thuggish behavior. We can't have this. And this is understandable from a state. A state needs to project power and put order and say, you can't just randomly burn stuff down. And the state then began to announce that they're going to have hate speech laws. And they were like, we're pushing this stuff through immediately. And the idea was that, all these people on social media, like Conor McGregor, they rallied up these guys and told them to do this stuff. And they're like, we're going to do this. And they had the mandate at that point to do that. They had the momentum and the energy, and like they could have gone with that. Now, this is where things get absolutely crazy, because the feeling at that point was that, wow, that was a big burst of energy that just came out of nowhere. You know, but first of all, it's like, I did not think that the Irish had that in them. And then there was this enormous, like, burning, Dublin was on fire because of this specific reason with all these specific sentiments. But then immediately afterwards comes the crackdown and the threat, the really serious threat of draconian hate speech laws. And just around about this time, a British man got put into prison for like putting up a sticker or something like this. And that was the effect of hate speech laws over there in England. So people were like, oh, good Lord, we're in trouble now. Because they're going to start to prosecute us for saying, you know, anything at all. This is like tyranny is coming in. But this pushback, this stamp down, was almost like a flash in the pan. It just had no force behind it. It had no legitimacy behind it. People just almost like criticized through it and said, no, wait a second. Yous are causing problems with your plan and your projects here to bring all these people in, and we don't like it. And this is us starting to say that we don't like it. And that was, you know, it was a bit wild, burning all those buses, agreed. But you need to start listening to us, because this is not how we want this country to go forward. And that sentiment started to get out. And there was this enormous forceful push. And again, about Irish politics is very localized. So in America, you probably will never meet your politicians. They all live up in like Washington, D.C. and the lobbyists and all this type of stuff. They operate up there. In Ireland, we certainly have something like that. But the local representatives are very well connected and very accessible, and people know them very well. You know, like you can just go visit their offices and chat to them, and oftentimes they'll be like members of the community and stuff. So it's very, very localized. And so if people have a problem, like, it's not like you email your senator or something like this. Like, you can literally just call a bloke and be like, here, man, what are you doing to the country there? Like, what's going on? You can ask him out for a pint, like, you know, and explain to him. It's like, stop doing this, stop doing that. So the legitimacy just took an enormous hit. It was almost like they tried to push back, and they were expecting to find this small group of thugs in North Dublin who like burning buses. And instead they discovered a tidal wave, and it just washed all that away, all this idea of this away, and there was this new consciousness just flooded in. And this was unbelievably overwhelming. And it really didn't quite land until actually quite recently, only about a month and a half ago or so, where the Irish state threw a referendum. And a referendum is to alter the constitution. And again, it just goes to show you like how out of touch and delegitimized the Irish state and regime and the paradigm has become, because this referendum was bizarre, you know, like, is the only word you can say. Because in this referendum you have all these descriptions of like, we want to rearrange the family, and like, we want to neutralize the concept of the family, you know. And it's like, why do we need this stuff? We have so many problems in the world that we're talking about redefining the meaning of the family. And they were trying to push it on some type of concept of like helping women or something like this. They were like, we want to help women stop being oppressed, or there was like some way that they were trying to drill it through. But the whole thing was, you this jargon. I know I rage up against jargon, but this was literally what it was. It was just all jargon. And you read through it and you're like, these dudes are trying to screw me. They're literally standing there holding like a dildo behind it or something. I know well they're trying to screw me somehow. This is nonsense. This is clearly just some crap. And everybody knew it. Everybody. And I mean, this is unanimous across the board. Everybody you bring it up, they'd be like, this nonsense. I'm voting no. And this is just a stupid. They're trying to shove through some political crap. And then everybody started to get really paranoid and conspiratorial that they're trying to do this because they want to create some type of loose definition of the family, so migrants, when they come in, can bring their family over easier by saying that, like, my extended family is my family, and then everybody comes over to, this type of stuff. So I remember hearing all this stuff. I was like, people they just don't trust the government at all anymore. It's completely delegitimized. And this referendum was pushed forward. Now, referendums cost about like $40 million to do, which doesn't maybe sound like a lot to American politics, who like spend $1 billion to throw a rock concert for their presidents or something like this. But to us, like that's a lot of cash. It's a big deal to run a referendum. You kind of have to be like, well, there should be a reason for this. This is a big deal. It's a big operation. It costs a lot of money, and it's very like you spend a lot of political capital with this. And the government got annihilated. Destroyed. I think every single constituency in the country voted against it. Basically just said, this is bullshit. Fuck you, man. Except this small part of South Dublin, which is essentially where like an awful lot of the administration comes from. So it's kind of similar to what you see happen where you have in America, you have Washington perhaps, and they make a lot of it. They're like the brain, and then the body must follow along in this interesting way. So we have this similar situation in Ireland. But if you wanted to compare it to something like America, it'd be like looking at a presidential map where California went to one president, but then every other state was the other president. Like Joe Biden gets California, Donald Trump gets everything else, or like the opposite way around, whatever. And so it's that unanimous feature of it, this overwhelming punch that was just like bullcrap. And at that point, it literally felt like it was over. Like I remember just that happening, and we were like, what the hell just happened? It was like the end of the entire woke era or something like this. I don't know how to describe it. It was the end of that consciousness of before. And it was this humiliating political moment where the people basically just said, fuck you, man. Like, we're done getting gaslit with this nonsense. It was the perfect symbol for it as well, because this is the problem with the sort of woke consciousness and the regime as it has used this stuff, is that it uses jargon. It uses political jargon, political correctness to drill forward nonsense. And people are usually too naive to realize what's happening, because they cover it up with niceness and they talk about rights for women and stuff like this, when really it is just some type of convoluted lawyer speak, because there's something else going on. And this was the first step where people said unanimously, the country was like, we're done. And the whole country pushed this way. The whole country said delegitimate bullshit crap. And so in the immediate aftermath of this, the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar retired. And, retiring means he's stepping down essentially in shame. And it was good. Like, he was kind of taking it on the chin. He was being like, look, I've lost this, like I've lost the people. They don't like me anymore. We've screwed this up. And he's stepping down. He's like, this is a blunder. I'm no longer able to be commander of the ship here. So he doesn't try to save face. He doesn't try to force it through. He gets what's going on. He says, like, I'm out. Now, this is a big deal for me because I've only known Ireland under the authority of Leo Varadkar. Now, that's going to sound weird for a democratic society, but this is the way these democracies, they don't quite work the way that we're told, because Leo was in a position where he was like, a minister, and then he steps up and becomes like Prime Minister Taoiseach, and then he goes and he does a private job and then comes back again. And so there's been something a little bit weird with all that, where he's been in high power for a long time, for much longer than the typical 4-year cycle of like, this type of thing. So there's something going on there nonetheless. And he's essentially ruled over Ireland, and his coalition has ruled, his team has ruled over Ireland through all these massive changes. He was essentially the sort of blossoming, the peaking of the woke consciousness, if you will. He was a gay, half Indian man who was running Ireland. Like, it's a really big deal coming from a Catholic white Irish country. And we see this guy, and he's authority over this, and he's sort of like the leader over this new woke era. And Ireland becomes very liberal, and it expresses itself as very liberal underneath his authority. And actually, there's a general sentiment going on in the British Isles related to this, because you have in, for example, Scotland, you have that Humza guy, the Scottish Prime Minister. You have Rishi, the Indian guy, down in England. And it's like all the British Isles are now ruled by men that are mixed race. And so that was the fulfillment, the blossoming, the triumph of the woke. The British Isles, the once seat of the most powerful empire in the world, the kind of the symbol of white European colonial power, was now ruled entirely by minority men from India or Pakistan or something like this. It's quite amazing, actually, when you think about it. And this was there about 6 months. That was the crowning of this moment. I think it might have been Rishi who got voted in, and that completed the picture, and all the British Isles are done. And so that was like the peak. That was like the apex moment, and the zenith had been reached. Top of the mountain was there, and this was woke consciousness at its apex. And then Leo was the first to fall. Sounds kind of extreme, but Leo was the first guy out of that breaks the axis of woke apart. And then what has actually happened only recently now is Humza stepped down. Humza was resigned. So Humza's down now as well. So now all of a sudden it's starting to look a bit tentative. It's almost looking like this coalition, this movement, this moment, this cultural moment is on the decline. And there's new consciousness rising. And so since then, this new type of consciousness has essentially become explicit. And I guess I should say, what is this new type of consciousness? Well, it runs on this predicate of people not wanting to get screwed. And this is quite a fascinating thing, because the whole paradigm of the previous woke coalition is that it's all about the white European males to understand that their role in society is to be compassionate givers. And that's what defines a man. A man is strong so much as that he can give, and so much he can give away. And so his role is to kind of shut up in the house and accept that he's, secondary to his wife, and her drama and her reality matters more. And he must not really focus too much on having loads of kids and propagating himself and all this. That's very selfish, and it's going to destroy the environment, and it's abusive of the third world, and it's just kind of offensive for some specific reason because it involves like some type of male self-interest. And instead, what he should do is spend his time trying to figure out some quirky little white guy technology that's going to save the environment or something like this, do this type of thing. Or reorder the structures of the systems to, build a future to help people. And the whole project of asylum seekers is about bringing all these other people in and basically sacrificing ourselves to help them and lift them up and make their lives easier, because that's the only, that's how morality works. And then obviously the same thing with feminism and with homosexuality and all this. The whole project, the whole point of your state is to try use this state that you have now, that you've won through history. The historical process has ended, and we're now in this end game where we're trying to reorganize culture. And you should use this state, your nation, your country, your regime, your institutions. You should use this to give gifts to these people, women, minorities, gay people, all these people who've been disenfranchised. You should use your privilege to lift up others. This is the sort of motif and narrative, and this really moves people. And I think there's something quite noble in a lot of people, that they do want to do things that are compassionate. They do want to do things that are good, if you will. But, it gets exploited. It gets weaponized, as people say. And so what you're seeing rising in opposition to this is essentially the polar opposite notion, which is self-interest and the sacrificing of compassion and this pathological empathy that you see as so dominant. And this consciousness is starting to become very, very strong. It's like, look, the point of Ireland is to put the Irish people first. And I know we have all these other things that we want to do, and I know the Europeans maybe are funding us to do all this, and I know all that stuff goes on, but I just don't want it. I don't want this country to be about that anymore. We're here because we want our country to be for us and to serve us. And I don't want to be a slave that is forced to participate in these projects. And I don't want to be replaced. And I don't want to be, humiliated, and I don't want to be spoken down to in my own nation. This is all the stuff that's starting to tilt inside of people. And it's not articulate, it's not clear, people aren't really aware of what it is. But see, people's instincts are always very strong. And so when you get kind of humiliated, spoken down to, when you feel like you're getting exploited, when you feel like you're getting screwed, this will naturally start to turn on eventually. Like, you can only push people so far to the point where people start to say, wait a second, what are you doing to me, man? And things now are starting to feel like a sort of boiling point where these projects are starting to really ramp up, where asylum seekers are getting pushed in at quite large amounts at this point, and people are starting to ask serious questions. And so this is what has led to the Newtown Mount Kennedy riots that took place in Wicklow only last week. And these are, again, another escalation of this problem, which is kind of showing us the crazy directions that this is probably going to start to take. Now, you see the action here is much more severe. You're seeing like organized state forces literally saying to the people, like, this is going to happen whether you like it or not. And some dark realities have come out about this as people have begun to study this. Of course, I have another video on this topic, so I'm going to play this now. A frightening revelation has come to the surface in regards to what we saw in Ireland recently. The state had to call in police forces to put down the Irish people because they were protesting and causing a ruckus about an asylum centre being placed in a small town. Now, the rhetoric that has been circulating since this event is that these people from the town, these Newtown Mount Kennedy people, have been agitated by people from England, from the far right in England, trying to get them to rise up and cause problems in Ireland and destabilise Ireland. And these people have committed a heresy, a high crime, because they've attacked the dutiful police forces. These are our servants of the state. These are the best men and women in the country who stand up and put on the uniform and work for quite modest wages in order to maintain order and maintain security in this country. And you know what? Fair enough. Let's bring this type of rhetoric onto the table. It is a treasonous, traitor betrayal of the Irish people and the Irish nation to be aggressive, to be nasty, to be belligerent towards our police forces. How dare you do that to an Irishman in uniform serving the country? That's wrong. How dare you do that against the Irish people, against the Irish state, against the Irish security forces? That's pure criminal behaviour. These people from Newtown Mount Kennedy, they're traitors against Ireland. Yes, let's go with this. Now, the problem here, my friends, is some very damning information has come to light. A lot of people in these protests noticed that the riot police spraying them with pepper spray did not have Irish accents. A lot of them had British accents. Now, I don't like blaming the British for everything. That can become a bit of a scapegoat, but this experience of hearing a man in armed uniform carrying a shield and weaponry spraying Irish people, innocent people I guess you could say, just protesting for their rights, for permission not to have people moved into their town against their will, not having colonists and planters come into their town, that's going to arouse blood memories. When you start hearing a British accent come out of these people, that's a bit of a suspicious thing. And you know what? Lo and behold, some people went digging and they found this old interview from a gentleman reading about a policy change for the Garda Síochána, the police force in Ireland, that went into place recently. And so it seems like the Irish state has done something, dare I say, treacherous. We Irish used to run our own recruitment centres for our police forces. We used to, take responsibility of being an independent nation by doing that ourselves. That was the whole point of our revolution, that we get to control these types of operations. But our Irish state that's so concerned with duty and honour and treason and betrayal and the sins against the Irish nation, they have chosen to outsource this crucial part of our security infrastructure, our police force, to a British company. And now the Irish people who constitute this nation, who are what this state is supposed to represent, it's supposed to represent our Irish interests and these people's interests. These people go and complain about the fact that they don't want to see their town transformed into something that's outside of their control. They don't want to have plantations imposed against their will. All of a sudden they're finding themselves getting stomped on by men in armed suits with weapons and British accents. Now, I'm not here saying we should all get black beanie hats and start cutting out the eyes. I'm not saying they're back. They're back and we're in trouble now once again. But it is important to point this out. This is an incredibly irresponsible behavior by the state. And we are essentially getting gaslit to the highest order, getting called traitors or saying that we're against the Irish people or we're attacking our own institutions. It's like these people who man these institutions aren't even Irish. Now that's a serious problem. And you have to start to question the intentions of the regime. Why are you bringing in foreign mercenaries to enforce foreign plantations in Ireland against the will of the native people? What exactly are your intentions here? Just be honest about it. Then we can have a discussion like we're supposed to in a democracy. Isn't this how this whole thing works? But look, I don't think we're going to get any straight answers anytime soon. All I can say is that something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Now, of course, as you can imagine, a lot of people have been asking, what the hell are the UK up to here? Why are the UK involved in this? What are they doing here? This is where the old conspiracies start to switch back on again. Now, there is rational reasons as to what you see happening here. I don't think the British are rubbing their hands together ready to get the Irish once again. I think they're actually really in bad situation with their own problems. And it comes down to the just stupidity of how these democratic states are operating with each other. The UK are obviously getting crippled by this exact same project as well. England, like London, is now, I think, 30% white or British or something like this. So London has been essentially transformed entirely by this type of project. And still more immigrants are getting poured into England, flooded into England. And the English are saying to themselves, oh God, we don't want these anymore. And France would ship them up, and all sorts of very strange stuff goes on with this, by the way. You should really start to look into it. Like, they will come to France, and France won't send them back to Rwanda, for example. France will send them to England. It's like this very sly, nasty state warfare thing. Not a good look. I don't like that from countries doing that to each other. Yeah, France and England, maybe is like to be at war and all this type of stuff. But why are you using brown people as some type of weapon? It's what are you doing there? It's very, very sneaky. They send them to England, and so England throw a tantrum about this. And England are like, we don't want these. We don't want these people coming in. And we don't want these people getting sent to us from France. We've already got way too many as it is, and people are very upset about it as it is. And so what do the English do? The English are starting to send them up to the north, because it's like, well, how do we get them back into the EU? They send them into Ireland. And now they're saying to us Irish, they're saying, hey, you send them back to France, because we're not taking them back. So it's like, they come up, France gets them, pushes them to England. England throws them over to Ireland. Ireland are like, I want to send them back to England. England are like, no, so they're telling us to send them back to France, and of course we won't do that because we're scared of annoying the EU and stuff like this. So you can see all these interesting higher level geopolitical problems where these hordes of brown people essentially are being weaponized and used. Like, no one actually has any compassion for them. No one actually cares. As much as like all the talk about this stuff, no one, like, people are like, these are just tools. These are geopolitical tools. These are trains, caravans of brown people. Who can I piss off with this? How can I destabilize my enemy with this? To illustrate this more, here's a short video I did on this. The former UKIP leader Neil Hamilton has just gone on the record as saying, I think we should send every illegal immigrant in Britain to Northern Ireland so they can just walk across the border into Ireland. My word, that's a heavy-handed statement. This makes me wonder if immigration is not some type of moral, compassionate project that all we Europeans are engaging in, but instead, immigration may be a tool of warfare utilized by bad actors and states to get vengeance upon people they don't like. This UKIP member from the UK is saying that he wants to do this to the Irish because the Irish had some petty problem with him during Brexit. It's all about the border in the north. So he's going to use brown people to punish us. Now, I thought brown people were these poor people from war zones that need to be embraced and taken in with open arms, and they're all individuals and they all have their own destinies and their own lives, but this man sees them as a military division, as a legion, as a barrel of ammunition that he can use to enact his vengeance upon the Irish. Now you might say, Steph, this is your Irish blood talking. You're just mad at the English as usual. But I actually have receipts on this. You see, lots of states and bad actors utilize immigration in exactly this way, as if it's a weapon of warfare. Take, for example, the Russians, who are currently at war in the east. And up on the top of Russia is Finland, which is one of their primary borders and a country they've always had problems with. Even in World War II, the Finns were a big problem. Now in 2023, you can imagine the Russians were thinking, we don't want any problems from those Finns up north. So they began to do something to destabilize them. This is me reading from an article. Finland is closing all crossings on the Russian border after accusing Moscow of deliberately helping migrants into the country. Around 900 asylum seekers entered Finland from Russia in November, up from fewer than one a day on average. They come from countries including Morocco, Pakistan, and Syria. Finland is determined to put an end to these crossings, says the Prime Minister. The government says Russia is channeling asylum seekers towards Finland in what it calls an influence operation and a hybrid attack. And it has responded by progressively closing more and more border. I have a feeling that in this situation, Vladimir Putin didn't care too much about brown people either. And another example of this comes from an active war zone in Israel. Europe has had this big issue where there's been a lot of pro-Palestinian sentiment in Europe. There's been lots of huge anti-Zionist protests and lots of sentiment among the European elite that, this war should not be prosecuted on Israel's behalf. And of course, understandably, if you're Israeli, why would you want this? You wouldn't want to punish people who take this attitude where you're not allowed to defend your nation. So Israel has suggested, very slyly, that the compassionate Europeans, places like Ireland as well, who love Palestine so much, well, what they should do is they should take in all the Palestinians. What Israel will do is get them out of Gaza and send them to you Europeans. If you love them so much, why don't you just take them all? Take all 2 million of them. And we get confirmation of this from Haaretz, where we read that both the coalition and opposition in Israel said transferring tens of thousands of Gazans to Europe is a moral imperative and an opportunity to demonstrate compassion towards the people of Gaza. And the far-right ministers were quick to express their support. Now, I have a feeling that the Israelis are not suggesting this because they have an enormous amount of compassion for brown people. Now, I'm saying all this because it's important to become savvy to the nature of modern warfare. This is psychological warfare combined with hybrid or fifth-dimensional warfare, as you heard the Finns mention, which means that I'm no longer in the 21st century going to run up and get loads of tanks and show up in your country and be like, I'm here to fight you guys, come on out and let's fight together. No, nowadays the way warfare happens is that you want to destabilize your enemy, psyop your enemy, confuse your enemy, ruin their brains. You want to go all Sun Tzu, Art of War on them before you actually fight them openly. And so in practice, if a bad actor or a state has a problem with somebody, they're going to do many things to try to destabilize that opposition. They will screw with their economy. They will put sanctions on them. Famously, the Europeans did this to the Russians. They will send in large amounts of migrants that the population are going to have to take on board and use their taxes to pay for them. God, it's awful when you think about it. Does anybody out here have compassion for the brown people? Are brown people just these little pawns that we move around on the chessboard as we try to attack our enemies? I think it would be fantastic for people in the West if they wised up and realized that this is how these guys who are calling the shots actually view these situations. It's not some compassionate decision. It's not some project of love. It's not somebody singing Kumbaya. These guys are running massive state operations, and they have their geopolitical enemies and their goals and these plans to transform the world in ways that they see fit to suit themselves. They see all these brown people as really useful tools in this project. They only want you to be compassionate and to be empathetic. This could not work unless their enemies had a problem with compassion and with empathy. How would the Russians pump Muslims into Finland unless the Finns had this quandary, this moral conundrum inside of their head saying, is it wrong or right to do this? Surely I have to be a good person here and just open up this border and let all these Russian agents in that are getting sent to my border. This is what they need to play on. You being a dummy who thinks that it rains pink flowers outside all day and the world is made of pillows. In the highly competitive world of states and global actors, they have realized that exploiting that very moral instinct inside of you is a great way for them to achieve their goals. And at that level, being nice and being fair and being honest doesn't matter at all. It's all about winning. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. This opens up a lot of cans of worms. This suggests that there's some type of state actors involved in this, and they're weaponizing these things to destabilize countries. And this is precisely the way that the UK is dealing with this. They don't really care about the brown people. It doesn't seem like anybody cares about the brown people. They just have their bickers with the EU. And they're like, you take the brown people. We don't want to deal with them. You sent the brown people over here. You feck off. We're going to send them to Ireland because that's part of the EU. And then when the Irish complain about this, it's like, well, you shouldn't have done Brexit, should you? It's not about these poor brown people. It's about borders. It's about who annoyed me, who annoyed you. These states are taking little bites out of each other. They're throwing tantrums. And this is where I believe we'll see the next legitimacy crisis, which will begin to advance all of these trends into its next phase, which I think are going to become much more serious. Because these topics are serious. We're talking about the permanent transformation of these nations. London is never going to be the same. Even if they have some incredible transformation where maybe they just start to deport everybody or something like this, and Rishi's speaking about this, they are going to have enormous chronic problems. Think of the scale and the insanity of doing something like this. This is such a big deal. It's going to cost bazillion dollars, It's going to be expensive. There's going to be so much political energy put into it. All the other things you could have spent that money on, and instead you just have to basically reverse 20, 30 years of bad decisions, if you will. Just this crazy project was put into place, and it's led to these permanent transformations that now people are sort of talking about, how do we walk these back? It's very, very serious. This happens in Ireland, it's permanent. There's a long-term chronic problem, and history will remember this. The movement of people are big deals, The migration of the Goths into Rome was a significant reason why Rome fell. These are big deals. These are really important topics. And the brown people themselves aren't mannequins, they actually are people who, if we're going to take them on their word, coming from war zones and stuff, and they're callously being thrown about as if they don't mean anything. And, that has to start to grate on people after a while, because it reveals that this is not about compassion. It's not about any of the bullshit that people say. That's just all jargon as usual. It's more lies. And you see through this cynically and understand what it is. You're like, this is a scam, man. This is unbelievable. Now, this is so serious because of how terminally it delegitimizes the current leadership in the British Isles and these projects generally. Now, maybe you might say, well, okay, that's one thing, what the immigration thing and all this. But the problem is that if that gets delegitimized, if the immigration project gets delegitimized, then the concept of multiculturalism gets delegitimized. And people start to ask questions about that, and that's where the cascade will go. And then that becomes a serious issue, because that's when you're starting to get at war with people's vision for the future, for the utopia. Like George Soros believes in the open society, and he wants to see society become more open and multicultural, so he's pushing with his resources to achieve this. Donald Trump's vision of America is that he wants the closed bordered society. He wants a nationalist society. His vision of the kingdom is, the big wall around things. Israel are taking over Palestine because they have a vision for united Israel in their space that they own. The Palestinians fight in the opposite direction. They want their space. They want to claim It's like everybody's got their vision of the future for the nations that they're in. And this multicultural vision is an enormous one. This is the utopia. This is what we're fighting for. This is what we're spending all our resources on building. And if that vision, if that kingdom, that archetype of the kingdom gets delegitimized, oh my God, man. First of all, a new one will have to come up in its place, and a lot of people will still stick to the old one. And people don't let go of visions very easily. They fight for them before they let go of them. And then you combine this with, obviously, there's probably very powerful interest that want to see these type of open societies be pushed forward. You combine this then with this rising consciousness that's literally happening instinctively within populations now at this point. The delegitimization of the leadership. You have all these forces combining together, and you're going to see a huge amount of conflict, I'd say. And again, maybe this sounds a bit crazy, but the vision does really matter. The vision of the kingdom. What is the kingdom of heaven's a big deal. In Ireland, we had the vision that we wanted Ireland for ourselves. And we fought against the English, and the English's vision for Ireland was that it was under English rule. We defeated them, got rid of them, and then we had a civil war. So why did we have a civil war? That's a crazy thing, that we go from like having this great victory essentially to just shooting each other immediately. Because the second we got free, because of the North, there was this huge clash of visions. It's like we want the whole island, and we want to continue to prosecute our war, or we're going to take what we have now and form a republic out of the 26 counties and leave the North. And there was a fight over that vision of the future of Ireland between the Irish. That's how big of a deal these things are. People go to blows over this stuff. It is conflict driven. And so we're kind of getting into this stage, which I guess in some sense is a good thing, where there's honesty. People are now starting to get straight up about like, well, what is your vision for the future? Where are we going? What is our project and our plan? And the one that is currently in place is starting to fall apart and delegitimize at the seams. And people just don't want it anymore. It's not turning out well. And the people who are pushing forward are hypocrites and liars, and they just come across wrong. They come across poorly. And so I guess the era that we're coming into now is, as it's going to begin with vision clashes, the clashes of the future of the world. That's going to lead to spill downs into many areas of life that are going to be quite wild. So we could be entering into an era of revolutions for all we see. And Ireland certainly is having a fiery experience of this. But I guess if you think about it, we are also part of the general project you see all across the world as well. So my friends, I'll leave it at that. Ireland is in flames. We're seeing the rising of a question against the vision for the future, and the rising of the possibility of new visions, maybe many different visions, and that's inevitably going to lead to a clash.